welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome everybody. This is Jessica, Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My library co-host is
Jen. Hello.
Hello. And we are welcoming back a guest who we love speaking with, but usually we speak to him about horror. And today we are kind of shifting gears. Please introduce yourself and tell us about this book.
Yeah, I'm Grady Hendrix. I'm the author of books like Horror Store and My Best Friend's Exorcism and the Final Girl Support Group. I mostly do horror. I also did a book called Paperbacks from Hell, which is a nonfiction account of the horror paperback boom in the 70s and 80s. So horror is my thing. But I wrote a book that just came out called These Fists Break Bricks, which is a history of Kung Fu movies coming to America. If you want to get the short one-line pitch, it's kind of like Paperbacks from Hell, but for Kung Fu movies instead of horror paperbacks.
Yeah, I know myself. I was, I grew up in the 80s around all of these. Of course, like I had to go to a karate dojo and learn karate.
Oh, sure.
Of course, back in the day, because that was as one did. I loved some of these movies so much.
Yeah, I think few American children did not take karate lessons or taekwondo lessons. That was mine, or something, it's a weird commonplace, where it's a very commonplace part of kids' childhoods, but it's kind of like, it's weird where it came from, right? Like it makes no sense when you think about it, but it makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the things I really liked about doing this book is everything comes from somewhere, right? Like things don't just spontaneously generate unless you're like a medieval philosopher or something and you think that white shirts turn into mice.
Wait a second. Jen is a bona fide PhD in medieval philosophy. So that could be a conversation for another time.
There you go. Yeah. But I mean, I think the medieval era, maybe the 18th century was the last time spontaneous generation was taken seriously. So it's always nice to like go back and see where stuff came from. And my co-author on this, Chris Bajali, he was a big fan of Paperbacks from Hell. And he said, I've got this huge collection of Kung Fu posters and ads and all this stuff. He's like, would you be interested in doing like a Paperbacks from Hell kind of thing with it? And I really wasn't at first, because without a story, without a beginning, middle, end, like how does this arc unfold? There's not much to write about except saying, look at this, look at that, look at this, look at that. There's no story there. And then Chris and I started talking and we started looking at, and Chris is he's a librarian as well. And he's an amazing researcher. And we started sort of going deep on stuff. And we realized that there really was a story here. I mean, that these movies appeared in America in March of 1973 when Five Fingers of Death premiered. It became this huge hit. Kung Fu movies like ruled American theaters in 73. Enter the Dragon came out. It's the same year Bruce Lee died, weirdly enough. And then they were sort of like took over pop culture for a really long time. I mean, they've got their fingers in sports and kids taking taekwondo classes and hip hop, the roots of hip hop, and street culture and street fashion and all this stuff. And then they were a huge part of they spread onto like television, right? In the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and VHS, and were part of the huge VHS boom and really fueled it. And then in the late 80s, all these television stations, once the FCC sort of deregulated a lot of rules in advertising, these stations were like, wait a minute, why are we paying to show these movies in these weird late night and Saturday morning time slots when we could just sell that to infomercials? And then cities started looking around and saying, why is so much of our like really valuable central real estate taken up with these grimy movie theaters showing Kung Fu movies? And it all ended. So it was this amazing like start to finish arc, and it was really took us forever. It took us like 2 years to write this book.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was something that I was actually curious about, which you kind of answered for me, which was how you met up with your co-writer and how you got started on that. But I was also curious if it had anything to do with your involvement with the New York Asian Film Festival, if that was where
Oh,
your info
sure.
came from. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really how I met Chris, is through the festival and its screenings. And then the other place it came from is I wrote this documentary for Netflix a couple of years ago. I think it came out in 2019, called Iron Fist and Kung Fu Kicks, which was a history of Hong Kong action cinema. And while doing the interviews for that, the director and I realized that there was so much we were leaving out, especially with where these movies intersected with politics. And we were able to talk about that some in the documentary, which is still on Netflix if people are interested. But what we realized is, the reason these movies took off in America, is not so much like, oh, there have been plenty of people talking about like how these movies are made and things like that. But no one really talks about what they're about. And these movies came out of 1967 in Hong Kong, which is when Hong Kong cinema changed and began making what we would recognize as modern day kung fu movies. And the movies came out of this huge year-long series of protests and riots and strikes that were largely anti-colonial in nature. I mean, and Hong Kong really did just sort of explode. I mean, there was something like, I think the bomb squad was called out about 1,100 times in 1 year, and something like 400 of the devices they were called to dismantle were active bombs. I mean, it was lots of people died. Kids were getting their arms blown off. I mean, the police were getting machine gunned. Helicopters were landing on buildings to conduct raids. It was crazy. And out of that came these really angry movies about kids who had nothing. They were usually poor, and they usually were fighting against a corrupt system, politicians, corrupt officials, something like that. And they had nothing, so they were fighting with kung fu, and they often died in the process. And those movies landed in America at a time when a ton of kids who were non-white, who lived in poor, mostly urban neighborhoods like the South Bronx, in Chicago and Boston and Detroit and Los Angeles. These kids had basically, were being told that they were worthless, and they were pissed off and they were angry. And here were movies starring non-white actors who were fighting the system, and they really were embraced by that audience and took off. And there's a huge, you can't talk about martial arts without talking about Black history and the Black experience in America and martial arts. And the
Yes.
two have been linked, since the 30s. So it was really, we were writing a lot of this book, or a big part of it, while the George Floyd protests were going on. And it was amazing to feel like, we were in some part, shining a light on this history. This history isn't forgotten. It's really well known in the martial arts community. It's known in parts, but it's less well known in the film community, and it's less well known outside the martial arts community. So it's really nice to be bringing a part of this history to a wider audience, and also to be, remembering some of these names that have sort of fallen out of the conversation, like Ron Van Cleef and Charles Bonnet and Steve Muhammad and all these guys, Vic Moore. I mean, these guys who really changed the landscape, but they're not remembered so much anymore outside the martial arts community.
Right, because there was there's a whole string of kung fu movies that I guess could be considered blaxploitation kung fu
Sure.
as well.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the blaxploitation film really, exploded about a year or two before this, with Cotton Comes to Harlem. And by the time 73 came around, blaxploitation movies were they were considered a little bit unsavory, And one of the nice things that kung fu movies did is, one of the issues with blaxploitation movies is the Black community itself was really conflicted over them, because they were often stories of crime featuring like drug dealers and pimps and all this stuff. And people felt like, well, what kind of heroes are these for our kids? So then you have these kung fu movies without that baggage. And it was really, really embraced by Black and Latin audiences across the country. I mean, as well as white audiences, but those are the audiences that really took it to heart, and distributors really realized that. I mean, you look at a lot of theaters and you look at their film schedules from the 70s, especially theaters in inner city neighborhoods or the South Bronx or the Combat Zone in Boston. And they were showing almost exclusively blaxploitation movies or black themed movies and kung fu movies, a lot of them.
That's really fascinating. And if you look through the book, there's some really interesting artwork.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's these movies, one of the big things with these movies is most of them, not all of them, but most of them were released by independent distributors. They weren't released by like Warner Brothers. Some were, definitely, but like Warner Brothers, Paramount, Columbia, Universal, they weren't releasing these movies. The people who were independent producers, and independent producers knew that 80% of the game was marketing. So they spent a lot of time and effort on the poster, on the campaign, on the tagline, and these guys were just, they were geniuses. There's a guy, Terry Levine, who ran a company called Aquarius Pictures. And he was, I'm just looking up a tagline he had because there's one of my favorite ones. So Terry really felt like if you didn't have the steak, you could just as easily sell the sizzle. So Terry, theater owner at the Selwyn, had a title from Aquarius called A Boy and His Dog. I think people remember it's a Don Johnson film set in the future. And it wasn't doing well. And so Terry's like, my good man, all you have to do is change the title on the marquee. And Terry's like, you change it to A Psycho Boy and His Killer Dog, Blood. It's just great,
That's like some William Castle stuff, but like with language right there.
Oh yeah. And he would advertise movies. He would take a flatbed truck and put like girls in bikinis in a cage on the back of it and drive it around town advertising like, Raw Force or Dr. Blood or something. It was just great value. When you see the theater fronts, and that's one bummer, is we weren't able to find really good photos that we could use of the Kung Fu movies, but they would make these things called fronts. The distributor would pay for them. And they would basically be these plywood constructions that would completely cover the front of the theater and then turn the entire exterior into an ad for the movie. And so, I think it was the Rialto, I'm not 100% sure, but in New York, after it closed, it still had these giant wooden ninjas that were part of a front advertising a ninja movie up outside of it for years after it closed, all through, even into the 90s, I believe.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I wish we could see those, because that was probably like I don't know, it's a really interesting sort of, gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like gonzo type of advertising.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And if you do a Google image search on, Times Square movie theater fronts, you'll see some of these. There just weren't good ones of Kung Fu movies for us to include that we were able to find. So but it was all about the advertising, and the reason these movies went to television is because, this guy, Mel Moran, was like, kids wanted to see these movies. They heard about them. They saw the ads. They saw the posters, and they looked amazing. Even the movies were sometimes garbagey. And, but their parents were terrified to let them go to the neighborhoods where these movies were shown, like downtown LA or wherever. And so, Mel Moran was like, if we can't bring the kids to the grindhouse, we could take the grindhouse to the kids. And that's how these movies came on TV and did such phenomenal business that within like the year of Mel's first package hitting television, there were 16 other packages being sold of increasingly worse movies. And that was always the problem with Kung Fu movies and any trend like this. The first few do really well. And so then every distributor wants some. And so pretty soon they're buying anything. I think someone said, as long as it ran 90 minutes and was on film, we could screen it. And so, they were selling some pretty dastardly stuff. Slash was one movie that as the distributor said, maybe one of the worst motion pictures ever made.
I have my opinions about that, but we're not going to talk about what I think the worst motion pictures ever made were.
Fair enough.
But I think that's always subjective. But, I think the amount of people in it. I mean, everybody knows Bruce Lee, but then there's also Sonny Chiba and Jackie Chan, who's still active to this day.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the first time I heard about Jackie Chan was we went to see Rumble in the Bronx with my parents, and my parents totally didn't
Sure.
get it. I'm not sure if I got it, but I knew I enjoyed it. And ever since, he's like a number one name, but there's like so
Was that in the
many.
90s when it came out?
It was, yes.
Yeah.
That was one of the movies I went to see with my parents in the theater and probably shouldn't have.
Right. Well, that's one of the interesting things about Jackie Chan is he became huge in Hong Kong in 78 when he sort of escaped from the shadow of Bruce Lee and started doing this kung fu comedy stuff that no one was doing. No one was really doing at that point. But in the States, they were still looking for the next Bruce Lee. And when Chan tried to cross over here in the early 80s, no one was that interested. I mean, his movies did good business. But then they ran into this huge problem with piracy. At one point, the distributor for Drunken Master, his second movie, was holding out for so much money that in the US in the early 80s, that finally someone just went down to Chinatown and illegally rented a print of Drunken Master and ran it in Times Square for weeks and weeks. And when the distributor came back around, the other distributor's like, your movie's been playing. and it was done. It couldn't get traction anywhere after that. So people made an attempt and the movies did well, but bad luck and the fact that people were looking for tough guys and Bruce Lee, not a comedian. And the big person who took on Bruce Lee's mantle in the late 70s, early 80s, because everyone wanted it to be a black actor. It was going to be Jim Kelly, and then Jim Kelly could be his own worst enemy, and that his movies didn't really pop the way people wanted them to. And briefly, people are like, maybe it'll be Yul Brynner, but that didn't happen. And then they thought Ron Van Cleef, and Ron had a really great career, but he could never quite cross over into the bigger budgeted stuff. And it was going to be this guy or that guy or Carl Scott or any number of these black martial artists who started making movies. But then, of course, came Charles Bronson, who'd been around. I mean, he'd fought Bruce Lee. He had that connection. But the fact was, he was a white guy and he came across as very affable and people liked him in the mainstream. And he became the next big martial arts guy because he was tough and likable and all those things. And he worked hard. I mean, no studio would, that's the amazing thing about Chuck Norris, is no studio would release his movies. Like his first movie was a trucker film and no one wanted to touch it. And so he wound up basically teaming up with this company that did nothing but provide tax shelters to people. They didn't release movies and they four-walled it. They basically would rent theaters from theater owners. They would pay the owner a set fee and then keep the box office for themselves. But that meant they were marketing the movie by themselves. Like the theater had no interest in whether the movie succeeded or flopped because they got paid either way. And it made millions of dollars. So then they went out with Chuck Norris's next movie and everyone's like, nah, we're not interested. It's a fluke. And they did the same thing. And that one made millions of dollars. So then they're like, okay, we've done this twice. We made about $20 million on each movie. Did it again? No one was interested. So they four-walled it again. He had to four-wall 4 movies before a studio would get interested. And what that meant, unfortunately, is that Chuck Norris basically spent 6 to 8 months of the year touring with the film, doing 4 or 5 appearances a day and television. And I mean, they said they worked him like a rented mule. And he was exhausted and trying to run his karate studios and do all that. So this guy like burned the candle, not just at both ends, but basically threw the candle in the fire for 4 or 5 years to have a career. So it's not like he lucked into it, but being white did not hurt.
I'm super interested in how the genre sort of changed in order to keep itself relevant and sort of in the eye of the public. And I was super fascinated by the development of the Bruce exploitation movies after Bruce's death. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because it is so fascinating to me that there were actually movies that like addressed his death and used that as a jumping off point.
Well, the weird thing about Bruce Lee is he shouldn't have been as big as he was. I mean, the guy was essentially an over-the-hill B-list television dude who was most famous for coaching celebrities in Kung Fu, who had a crippling back injury and had basically like decided he was never going to make it in America, And so he went to Hong Kong and kind of lucked into making a couple of movies, like basically 3 movies. And they became huge. And I mean, it was absolutely not what should have happened. And those movies became huge, and Bruce was very smart, and he secured a deal with Warner Brothers that he really fought hard for to make Enter the Dragon. And then a month before Enter the Dragon came out, he died. So this guy like had the most improbable career ever. But as soon as he died and Enter the Dragon came out and became this massive, massive hit, it really everyone wanted to anything Bruce touched could be famous, you know, like, I mean, the Bruce Lee Museum opened, which just had knickknacks in it, you know, out in LA. You know, Bruce Lee photos were valuable. Any scrap of film footage, people started attaching his 8-minute screen test to the front of movies so that to attract new audiences. They attached a short film of his funeral that featured all this footage of his corpse to movies to get audiences to come see it. And this 11-year-old kid whose dad was sort of a fly-by-night distributor named Larry Joaquin, this 11-year-old kid, his son Marco, was like, Dad, you know, he did this Green Hornet TV show. We should get the movie rights for it. And I think Larry, no one saw any value in this old TV footage of this show that had flopped after a season and been canceled. And so they were able to get the rights for like $15,000, something ridiculous. And Larry and Marco, this 11-year-old boy, basically re-edited that footage into a movie called The Green Hornet and a sequel called, I think, Fury of the Dragon, that became these huge global hits. And so after that, people were like, oh, okay, we can make our own Bruce Lee movies. So any scrap of, they found, because Bruce had been a movie star when he was a little kid in black and white melodramas in Hong Kong, people grabbed those and edited movies around them. People, and then people started realizing, you know, they realized that Warner Brothers, Bruce Lee's home, was looking to make a giant biopic of Bruce Lee based on a book written by his widow, Linda. And they conducted this search, like Barbara Streisand was going to produce it, to find a Bruce Lee lookalike. It was a huge effort. I mean, but Linda was one of the judges that looked like Barbara Streisand was on hand. I mean, it was this massive thing. So all these fly-by-night producers were like, we could do that. And so they just started looking for people who looked like Bruce Lee to be in Bruce Lee bios, which are bizarre. I mean, some of them are so weird. And have very little to do with Bruce's life. And then people are like, well, if we're making these, why don't we make sequels to his movies with Bruce Lee lookalikes? So they did that. And then they made sequels to the sequels. And then they would be like, well, you know, we've made Bruce Lee movies about his life. Let's make movies about Bruce Lee lookalikes trying to solve Bruce Lee's death. And then they were like, hey, why don't, instead of making a movie about Bruce Lee's life, we make a movie about Bruce Lee in the afterlife and going to hell. And so you just got these movie after movie. I mean, hundreds of them. Chris and I, you know, sat down and we determined we're going to figure out who every Bruce Lee imitator is. Because, you know, it was kind of like people say, oh, there were all these imitators, and they usually name 4 or 5, but then they stop. And, you know, Chris and I were like, no, we're going to figure out who all of them were. And good Lord, man, I mean, it was, I can't even remember how many we wound up with. I think it was, let's see, there are the 3 big ones: Bruce L.I., Bruce L.E., and then Dragon Lee. Then there's Bruce K.L. Lee. Then there was like Bruce Pack, Bruce Lai, Bruce Tai, Robert Lee, Sonny Bruce, Bruce Lowe, Bruce Jung, Johnny Yun, Evan Kim, Myron Bruce Lee, Snapper Lee, Judy Lee. It goes on and on. Brute Lee, Bruce Hazara, Bronson Lee. I mean, it went on and on and on. It was just endless. But we did nail it down. It was 20 something of them.
Oh my gosh.
That is,
so yeah.
Yeah.
So the Bruceploitation genre was just wild.
So making this book, well, did you have like a favorite thing that you sort of discovered while you were putting it together?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really, there were 2 things that I mean, there was a ton of stuff. I mean, we found everything from like the CIA secretly funding karate movies to try to skunk out communists in the Japanese film industry.
About that? Because that is
yeah,
majorly crazy.
Yeah, I mean, so that was in, I think, 1961, this storm window salesman and television chef in New York named Joel Holt he was a big karate enthusiast, and he wanted to make a karate movie. and he wanted to shoot it in Japan. And he came across this producer who found the money to back it, named whose name at the time he was using was Robert Sandstrom. And Robert Sandstrom was a CIA agent who had been trained, because the CIA was terrified that they were communists in the Japanese film industry, which was having this huge resurgence in the early 60s. And so basically they funded this karate movie to go shoot in Japan to root out the communists. And Sandstrom didn't find any communists, actually, because there weren't really any. Instead, he met his wife, one of the actors in the movie, and like fell in love, and they had kids, and that was their story. I mean, it's this weird little like snippet. And Joel Holt went on to not do a whole lot. He does the voiceover for some sexploitation movies like Olga's House of Shame. But Robert Sandstrom actually, a few years later, was heading the spy plane mission that took the photos of the Soviet missile bases in Cuba that started the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you can find Karate Hand to Death. I think it's in YouTube on its entirety, and it's not a particularly good movie, but it's interesting. But I mean, everything from the New York Times starting this totally unfounded rumor that turned into this racial panic, that black street gangs were called the Blood Brothers were learning how to murder white people with karate and judo, and were out to kill whites in this was the early 60s.
This is almost like has like satanic panic mentality here.
It was definitely a total racial panic, completely fabricated by the New York Times. They've never apologized for it. They've never acknowledged it. And it really, and part of the whole thing with it, I wouldn't say they're directly responsible, but several people went to prison for a very, very long time over this. Black people, shall I say no more. And in the NYPD, really that summer, they were so terrified at this gang that they flooded Harlem with cops, which, basically turned it into this lockdown occupied zone, which a lot of people feel like that tension that summer is what led to the riots in Harlem, which had a nice death toll with them. So, it really was not the New York Times finest hour. But I gotta say two things that were really, really meant a lot to me is one is, the story of Charles Bonnet, which I don't want to go into because it's really long, but if you get the book, Charles's story really was amazing. And Charles was the nicest guy. We interviewed him a couple of times for the book, and he actually passed away before the book came out. And so it was nice to give him his moment in the sun. But the two things that really sort of took me by surprise, one is I think everyone remembers Billy Blank from Tybo, the Tybo guy. And I really have a lot of respect. This book gave me a newfound respect for Billy Blank, because throughout this book we followed the lives and careers of a lot of Black martial artists like Jim Kelly and Ron Van Cleef and all these guys, Ty Mack, all these guys who they just never made it to the big time in film. Some of them did huge in the world of martial arts, but a lot of them tried to do films, and it just never panned out the way they wanted it to. And a lot of it was bad luck. A lot of it was being Black. A lot of it was, that it just didn't work for them. And so seeing Billy Blanks as this Black man, a martial artist who started this video empire that made him a gazillionaire many times over, who never got ripped off, who always kept his rights, who made it happen for himself after seeing so many of these martial artists get taken advantage of. It was really nice. And I kind of feel like Billy Blanks is such a happy ending to that story. But the other one that really was nice to see is Sho Kosugi, who's famous for being the big famous ninja guy in the 80s, because the story of Japanese martial arts in America is a weird one. There was a huge judo craze at the turn of the century, huge. Teddy Roosevelt was doing judo, and it became this huge thing. And then when World War II happened and we put every Japanese American citizen in a concentration camp, I mean, that really wrecked the world of judo for a very long time and really caused a lot of bad blood. And you looked at also the fact that there were really only 4 Japanese character actors in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s. And they mostly played houseboys and spies and traders and white slavers and gardeners. And it actually, no Asian person, no Japanese person did martial arts on screen until the 60s. And often then they were the bad guy and all this. And then you get to Sho Kosugi, who is this Japanese immigrant who came to the States with nothing, went from being this anonymous stuntman in these ninja movies to being a star. I mean, one of the few Asian actors whose name, actually probably the first Asian actor whose name went over the title in a movie. And he owned his career. I mean, he edited his movies. He did the merchandising for his movies. He did the stunts in his movies. He selected what project. He ran his ship. And to see that, to go from Japanese Americans, being punished for doing judo, being put in concentration camps, being thought of as the enemy and the threat, and not even having their faces on screen. Often Japanese people doing martial arts in movies in the 40s and 50s, and even in the 60s, were white performers in yellowface. To see then a Japanese American actor really take charge of his career and become famous for being Japanese and become famous for this Japanese martial arts was really a fascinating end of that sort of like trajectory.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me how the narrative of how these films came to be so popular kind of mirrors the narratives of the films themselves, and that you have these people who are doing labors of love against the systemic forces, and how it happens today.
Yeah, and doing it with very few resources, doing it with their bare hands, and somehow changing the world in the process.
This was awesome. We do have to wrap up, but
Yes.
This was such a wonderful talk. I'm so excited that you came to discuss this with us.
No, thank you for having me.
Cannot wait to talk about your next horror book as well, or anything else. You're always welcome. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My library co-host was
Jen. Goodbye.
And back with us, hopefully not for the last time, was the author,
Grady Hendrix, and I'm not here for the last time. It's good to see you again, Jessica, and great to meet you, Jen.
All right, so check out These Fists Break Bricks. I know that this is going to be a Valentine's Day gift for my husband. And
nothing says love like Kung Fu and ninja.
We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.